Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Khloe Evans and I work at the Office for National Statistics. I'll be chairing the session today. So welcome to the effects of COVID-19 on business and the labour market session. So we've got three presenters this afternoon, one of which is myself. Each presenter is going to have 20 minutes to present their work, and then there will be 10 minutes for Q&A after each talk. If you do have a question, please use the Q&A facility at the bottom of your screen. And if you're then invited to ask a question, we'll unmute you and you can introduce yourself, your name and your affiliation, and then ask your question. So I'm now going to hand over to our first presenter, which is Emily Hopson from the Office for National Statistics. So over to you, Emily.
Thank you, Chloe. Just going to start sharing my screen, 2 seconds. Okay. So as Chloe mentioned, my name is Emily Hopson and I work for the Office for National Statistics. And today I'm going to take you through the insights of the business impact of coronavirus survey, looking at waves 2 to 12. The ONS implemented the business impact of COVID-19 survey, otherwise known as BICS, in a matter of weeks, where traditionally the creation of new surveys can take 6 to 12 months. During a great time of uncertainty, it was essential to provide quick and coherent data on the impact of the pandemic, with data being used in real time by decision makers to identify the strategies needed to respond to the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on the UK's economy and society. The voluntary fortnightly business survey has provided qualitative information on turnover, workforce, prices and trade, which has offered further insights around these business dynamics. We also have questions to track those who are returning to trade, as well as insights on labour and capital expenditure. Final results of each wave of BICS are published in the fortnightly bulletin, Coronavirus and the Economic Impacts on the UK, and flash headline figures are presented in the weekly Coronavirus and the Latest Indicators for the UK Economy and Society publication. As I mentioned just now, BICS is a fortnightly survey, and questions are reviewed and updated as part of each fortnightly wave. We now have final results of 12 waves, which collect responses from businesses during a certain period. However, in some questions, businesses were asked to answer the question for the time they answered the questionnaire, not the reference period of the wave. The sampling frame used in BICS was designed to achieve adequate coverage of the listed industries from the monthly business survey, otherwise known as the MBS, the first 6 waves. The sample size has increased over the waves to improve the coverage of regions and different business sizes to ensure the sample was more representative of all businesses. The sample design for wave 7 of BICS was reviewed and refreshed and went live from Monday the 15th of June for the 2-week period. This new sample design is the basis for future waves, and questionnaire will now go to approximately 24,000 businesses from wave 7 onwards. This sample redesign improves our coverage for the smaller sized businesses. This sample redesign had led to a fall in response rate as it included more smaller and medium-sized enterprises. However, while response rates dropped, the number of responding businesses didn't as the sample increased. The sample redesign led to businesses being sampled independently. However, there is a strong overlap with the MBS sample, especially with the larger sized businesses. The results presented today are currently unweighted. However, with the resample design introduced in Wave 7, we have published an article with preliminary weighted estimates, illustrating BICS' early estimates of weighted results for trading status, turnover, and workforce. Looking at these initial results, the difference between weighted and unweighted estimates are minimal when size matters, for example, when weighting by turnover or employment. This shows the effectiveness of previously published estimates as they represent a similar trend of the impact of COVID-19. The following sections focus on responses from all businesses from waves 2 to 12. Final results from waves 1 to 12 can be found in the detailed business impact of COVID-19 survey results on the ONS website. To meet the priority needs of users, wave 1 of BICS was implemented rapidly as a pilot study, in which we asked high-level questions of businesses to better understand whether we'd be able to collect the timely and relevant information that we wanted to provide to our users. For this reason, Wave 1 has not been included in this analysis. Caution should be taken as different waves have different response rates, and based on the voluntary nature of the survey, different businesses could choose to respond to different waves. Due to the routing in the questionnaire, only certain businesses answer certain questions. The analysis presented today only covers a tiny proportion of the type of data we are able to collect within BICS. First of all, looking at turnover. Of businesses that continue to trade, more reported a decrease in turnover at the start of the pandemic lockdown in waves 2 to 5, with businesses starting to make a small recovery in turnover when lockdown restrictions started to be lifted in waves 6 and 7. It shows a shift from businesses reporting substantially lower than normal turnover levels during the height of the restrictions in place through April and May, to less businesses reporting lower than normal levels of turnover from wave 8 onwards. Looking at the red bar at the bottom, which shows substantially lower than normal turnover, this decreased from its peak of 48% in wave 5 to 25% in wave 12, which is a lower figure recorded than in wave 2, which was 39%. It also provides some more insight that the economy might be contracting at a slower pace, given that fewer firms are also responding that turnover was substantially lower than might be expected at this time of year. While the teal and green bars near the top, representing an increase in turnover, are more visible from wave 6 onwards. In wave 12, 13% reported turnover was higher than normal for this time of year, the largest percentage seen in our results. BICS provides us with some further insight to industry level breakdowns. The wave 12 findings show that industries that are still most adversely impacted are the arts, entertainment and recreation sector and accommodation and food service activity sector, which are in line with those that are amongst the most impacted by the restrictions in place. Businesses in these industries have consistently reported one of the highest percentage of businesses having a decrease in turnover across waves 2 to 12, with businesses in the arts, entertainment and recreation industry reporting their largest decrease in turnover in wave 7 at 86%, while for businesses in the accommodation and food service activity sector, their largest record was also 86%, but in wave 8. These sectors have reported a slower recovery in turnover compared to others, with 74% and 58% reporting a decrease in turnover in wave 12 respectively. The construction sector reported the largest difference of businesses responding their turnover decreased from wave 2 to wave 12. Of businesses continuing to trade, 73% of businesses reported a decrease in turnover in wave 2 compared to 44% in wave 12. One concern that businesses have raised in response to the coronavirus pandemic has been cash flow issues, reflecting the adverse impact on their turnover. Despite nearly 50% of businesses reporting less than 6 months cash reserves, including no cash reserves, across all waves, responses to cash flow have been stable. As mentioned before, businesses in the arts, entertainment and recreation and accommodation and food service activity sector reported the highest percentage of businesses reporting lower than normal levels of turnover from waves 2 to 12. These two industries also have a high percentage of businesses reporting they had less than 6 months of cash reserves left. 58% of businesses in the accommodation and food service activities industry reported having less than 6 months cash reserve, including none, in wave 12, with 51% of businesses in the arts, entertainment and recreation sector reporting the same. Another feature of BICS is that it's voluntary in nature, and so response rates might vary over time, so different businesses could choose to respond to different waves. Recent articles on analysis over time have captured common business responses on how their turnover, workforce and trade have been affected in the 2-week reference period. We have updated some of this analysis for the most recent time period. There have been 898 businesses who responded to every wave from wave 2 to 12. These businesses are not necessarily completely representative of the wider BICS sample, but this has allowed us to track this panel of firms over time to see how the impacts of COVID-19 on their business have evolved. Of these panel of businesses continuing to trade across all 11 waves, 6% reported turnover was considered substantially lower than normal in every wave, and 2% reported that turnover was a little lower than normal for the entire period. Less than 1% of this panel of businesses reported an increase in turnover relative to normal in every questionnaire returned from wave 2 to 12. There has been a slight increase in this panel of businesses reporting a decrease in turnover from the start of the pandemic till May, with 56% reporting a decrease in Wave 2 compared to 60% in Wave 6. From Wave 6 onwards, this panel of businesses has showed slow recovery, with more businesses reporting an increase in turnover or turnover unaffected and less reporting a decrease in turnover than previously. By Wave 12, 10% were reporting an increase in turnover compared to 3% in Wave 3. Of businesses in Wave 12, 22% expected an increase in turnover in the next 2 weeks, while 9% expected a decrease and 64% expected turnover to stay the same, with the remaining responding they were not sure. Businesses might interpret the expectation questions differently, with some answering the question in terms of the next 2 weeks relative to the previous 2 weeks, or the next 2 weeks relative to their normal expectations for this time of year. The expectation question states, what are your expectations for the next 2 weeks? BICS has allowed for many different streams of analysis, including longitudinal data analysis, following business responses over the weeks, linking to other data sources to provide additional insights into businesses during the pandemic, such as the labour market, and to help validate other ONS business surveys and provide supplementary evidence. Please find links on the slides to our regular publications or standalone articles that have used BICS data. The UK's BICS has provided business-led evidence to support both the regular ongoing traditional monthly and quarterly statistical outputs in a quality assurance capacity, but it's also enabled more timely estimates of economic activity to form part of the evidence base for high-pressure policy decisions. The results presented today show how businesses' turnover suffered greatly from the start of the pandemic. However, as restrictions started to be lifted in June, businesses' turnover has slowly increased, but has still not reached pre-lockdown levels. We continue to explore the potential for further development in BICS and consider what future requirements may be needed by stakeholders. The need for weighted results has been more critical to provide an estimate of how all businesses have been impacted from the start of the pandemic. With weighted results, comparison across waves will be feasible, showing how different times during the pandemic have affected different industries and different sized businesses. ONS published an article into the insights of weighted BICS results on September the 14th, with the plan to switch to publishing weighted results fortnightly in late September. A recent ONS user consultation in August sought detailed feedback to understand future requirements. With responses from over 20 separate users, including government departments, devolved administration, and local government, the strong message for emerging data needs that came through included maintaining the survey at 2-week intervals, at least in the short to medium term, continue with publication of a detailed bulletin and accompanying dataset, which captures all the breakdowns for the different variables of different size bands of businesses and regional data. Use the BICS approach to help measure the impact of other events, such as the UK exiting the European Union. And finally, to produce further regional estimate analysis to help monitor local lockdowns. I now open the floor to questions and ask if you have been using the BICS data, how have you been doing so?
Brilliant, thank you, Emily. Looking at the Q&A box, I don't think we have any questions at the moment. I did have a question, so I can ask that now and give other attendees a little bit of time to think about their potential questions. So you mentioned the speed at which this new survey was implemented, which is really, really impressive. So I was just wondering what you would say the biggest challenge was for implementing the survey and getting the results out in such a timely manner.
I think the hardest aspect that I found was just understanding the format that the data came in. But that was like understood, and we built like pipelines to kind of like create the tables that we needed. It's really speedy now to understand the data that we need and get.
Brilliant. We've also had another question from Kimberly, and a question also from Hannah has come through. So perhaps if we can go to Kimberly first, would you like to introduce yourself and ask your question?
I don't believe Kimberly is able to unmute herself, so Khloe, could you read out the question, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
So Emily, question from Kimberly. First of all, she said that was a great presentation. And her question is, are you able to link this survey to other sources that might allow asking if women versus men, people of varying backgrounds, or other groups of workers cluster differentially in the businesses in the different experience bands?
Thank you for your question. Currently, not at the moment. We don't collect any data like that. The only way to be able to link the data is by the reference number of the business, which can be found on the IDBR. So unfortunately, not at the moment. Sorry.
Brilliant. Okay. Thanks, Emily. We've also got a question from Hannah Thompson. Would you like to ask a question, Hannah?
Hello, I hope you can hear me. Thank you. I was just wondering if you have any concerns at all that when answering the questions, people's perceptions of what is normal might change over time as the weeks go on, and so when they're answering the questions in the later waves, they're answering it partly with reference to what they've experienced in the previous 2 weeks as being normal.
Thank you for your question, Hannah. Yes, so that's a very good question. The questions actually state what is normal for this type of year. I just shortened it down for the presentation. So when businesses are asked to compare what they perceive as normal, it's looking at this time last year.
Great, thanks, Emily. So we also have another question from someone who's unable to unmute, so I'll read that one out for you as well. So the question is that the high-level con response, particularly amongst smaller companies, which are relatively underrepresented, may imply that already more companies have stopped trading than has been indicated by the headline figures, particularly in some activities. What efforts have the ONS made to estimate for non-response characteristics?
Thank you for your question. Obviously, the results I presented today were unweighted. As I mentioned before, we have published preliminary weighted results where we take into account the different sized businesses and the majority of businesses in the UK being made up by smaller sized businesses. So I'd recommend checking that article out on the ONS website. It will be linked in the PowerPoint slides that will be available. And in that, you'll be able to see the impact of looking at all businesses' results from the BICS data.
Brilliant. Thanks, Emily. So there's no other live questions at the moment. I'll just give it a minute or two because you're very much under time. So we've got time if anyone does have any more questions. So I think Kimberly has got a follow-up question. Okay. So the IGBR does contain the total number of women and men employed by businesses which complete PAYE returns. So linking to the IGBR would allow some additional analysis. So perhaps just a comment to follow up on your response to the question.
Yeah, so it's not something that we've looked into, as we're just looking at the impact COVID-19 has on businesses.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant.
Thank you.
So final call for any last questions for Emily. Which I don't think there are. So I'm now going to hand over to Christopher Payne, who is also from the Office for National Statistics. So thanks very much, Emily, and over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Chloe. I'll just share my screen. And okay, so good afternoon, everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about how individuals have used their time during the pandemic. And I should say that that's based off the sort of time period between the 28th of March and the 26th of April. And I'm going to take a particular focus on how sort of the division of labour has been sort of shared across individuals with both paid work and unpaid work. That's everything we do for ourselves instead of contract out to the market, such as things like unpaid childcare, unpaid adult care, and so on. Without further ado, I shall give you a preview of what I've got in this presentation. So the contents include the initial data needs, which drove our decisions to collect the time use data, because this project has been a few years in the making. So the diary study specification, which enabled the collection of the data of how we used our time during the pandemic. Then how the COVID-19 impacted the data needs. And then I'll show some wave 1 results from the pilot and discuss wave 2 and beyond of the project. So the initial requirements and what drove the start of this time use data collection project was actually sort of stems back really to the 2009 Stiglitz report, where there's many recommendations which have influenced the last 10 years of work at the ONS to look sort of beyond GDP as a metric for living standards and quality of life, and to start to emphasize some of the household perspective, what it's like to live in the UK or another economy. And so actually we were really interested in building on or taking into account the ONS 4 questions. That's for well-being questions, subjective well-being questions on life satisfaction, worthwhileness, happiness, anxiousness. So they feature in a number of surveys, a wide range of surveys actually, and they're a really good way of understanding a full spectrum of people's subjective well-being. But we wanted to build on that by starting to collect really my
detail about. Sorry to interrupt you, Chris. At the moment, only your first slide is displaying, so I'm not sure if you'd meant to move on to future slides, but at the moment we can only see the first slide.
Apologies.
That's all right, no worries at all. I just wanted to let you know.
Okay, is that better?
That's perfect. Yeah, they're flicking through now. Okay. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Thanks for letting me know. So yes, we've the enjoyment of time. We wanted the minutiae detail about how people's experience of moment to moment was being sort of affected by changes in the economy. So digital services, the balance of work. Sort of really getting into sort of the detail of how our experience is and the household experience, and closely linked to that is the work-life balance. So we wanted to understand sort of how things were changing in terms of working patterns. A century ago, there was a belief that there would be much more leisure time. Actually, that hasn't transpired. People have continued to engage in work even when they could probably afford to work less hours, and some of the impact of luxury goods or positional goods, things in fixed supply like housing, and sort of status symbols or aspirational goods are probably driving some of that. But also work is actually really a good thing for people's well-being as well. So just going to work provides a sort of network of people to engage with as socially, and gives a feeling of purpose. So those are also factors that we sort of wanted to understand that more fully and how that's affecting how people feel day to day. We also wanted to understand about the distribution of total work. So there's actually a push, for women to rejoin the labour market and to enter paid work. But of course, there's an awful lot of unpaid work, childcare and other tasks which traditionally been done by women, but now there is a convergence. Who is picking up that work and how is that being shared within households? So it's important to understand how policy is impacting the total workload on individuals, not just the paid work. So we also wanted to understand how the definition of unpaid work might be affected by digital services. So some of the things that you can do at home for yourself now can offset some of the things that perhaps you would have contracted out to the market, such as maybe you can you don't need to go into a bank to use a clerk anymore. You can do online banking. You might arrange all your own holidays, sort of, and just say, well, I don't really need a travel agent. And so there's a range of things which is enabled by digital services, which we're interested in sort of tracking. There's always been the opportunity for people to do these things themselves, but actually we're interested in to what extent the internet services have enabled people to do this more often, and we think we should be tracking them from a quality of life perspective. So beyond that, we've been interested in the sort of services which you receive via sort of your smartphone and these sorts of things, or Netflix, which come at sort of no extra cost. Once you pay a subscription, you get an enormous amount of content, and so trying to unpick the impact of that sort of requires quite a detailed measure of how individuals are using their time and the experience that they're getting from those services. And finally, sort of thinking about utility in more detail, the importance of sort of household time as a factor in what Becker called Z-goods, which basically describe the idea that a good is the utility from the good is not really experienced until you utilize the goods, and so a combination of household labor in using the goods and the also acquisition of the good from the market requires to actually experience the utility of that goods. And finally, there's more detail required about the sharing economy and how these different forms of work have impacted different groups of individuals. So we wanted to try to differentiate different types of work within the time diary or within this time use study. So the time diary that we've developed is an online tool which has the advantages of really dropping the cost of a time use survey, which can be quite expensive. We've not used a field force for it, and we've also capitalized on some of the ability to be able to use pop-up questions and to build on additional detail to the activities as people enter in their time. We also used a telephone unit where people may not be able to access the internet to then sort of populate the diary. We did look at a range of different solutions before arriving at a time diary, and those included sort of trying to use big data and administrative data to sort of see if we could start to unpick some of the time use aspects, but it's really difficult to get such a detailed record of people's time. Even if you've got something like geolocation data, which is showing where people have been, you essentially have sort of digital footprints, and without a detailed sort of commentary from people about what they've done or how they've experienced it. One solution is possibly to ping people a message. If it looks like they went to a supermarket, you can ping them a message to say, were you going to the supermarket to do shopping, or were you going to work? So you can sort of set up a sort of smart device based study like that, but actually we foresee that to some extent there's always a necessity to have a sort of online diary component to that. So that's what we've started to develop. So this stage, or so this year, the point where we were just coming to pilot the study, COVID-19 and the pandemic came along and really sort of changed the game, if you like. And this resulted in us having to reconsider whether actually we wanted to continue with the pilot study. We were a bit concerned that wouldn't be a representative sort of or a sort of more normal time use to compare against previous time use studies to check to see if our diary study had been effective. But actually, there were many different aspects that would, that this diary study would sort of contribute some really useful findings to. One of the advantages of a time diary study is actually it's really detailed in a balanced approach to collecting people's activity. So by asking about everything that people are doing and without sort of specifying one type of activity or over another, just by purely asking them what they spent most of their time doing and then having them fill out a diary, it means that people have to sort of put down a sort of sequential order of activities, which helps to moderate what they've entered into their diary. If you ask them in a stylized questionnaire, then they may say, specifically about something like volunteering or gym use, then for their best intentions, they try to reflect an accurate recall of how they've engaged in those activities over, say, the last week or maybe the last month. But actually, it's very easy to let your sort of aspirational self cloud your judgment. And one of the advantages of the time use study is you get quite a detailed picture without sort of so much bias. We're only asking individuals for 1 weekday and 1 weekend day of their time, so they only have to reflect over sort of they have 24 hours to recall, and they have up to 48 hours to then put that time down. So the sort of questions we wanted to answer were using this data, and we did decide to go ahead with this study, were the sort of quantifying the impact of the lockdown on people's behaviour. So really, there were a lot of sort of claims about different impacts on groups, but we wanted to put a time metric to it. We wanted to show how the lockdown had impacted the division of labour. So with people moving to home-based work and also children needing to be homeschooled, how was that affecting different groups? So our first release was about 4 weeks after we collected the first wave of data. And we wanted to give a really an overview of how people's time had changed during lockdown. So what we did was we took the results from the Wave 1 study and mapped them across to a previous 2014-15 time use study for the UK. And these were the results. So in testing for sort of significance of these results to see what significantly changed and what hadn't, quite often this sort of time diary data isn't parametrically distributed. So we've used a non-parametric tests. You tend to see, because we're taking averages across all diaries, there's of course days when people don't engage in any of the act or in the activity which you're interested in. So you get zeros within your averages, which drags down the average, which is why some of these minutes may look low. But the benefit of doing it that way is actually that you get both a representation of the frequency, which people are doing something, that you're finding the frequency within diaries. You're also getting a reflection of the duration when they do engage in it in one metric. So it's a good sort of high level change assessment. So the major differences which we found were broadly, the biggest difference was of course the travelling and transport dropping by around 80%, and that reflects, or it matches up quite well with other studies which have shown sort of transport figures dropping down to about 20% at the early lockdown. We also saw a large shift from full people not working from home, or working away from the home, I should say, and a sizable increase in time working from home. We finally saw a big increase in leisure time, the entertainment, socialising, other free time, and a little bit of an increase in sleep and rest, and quite a large percentage increase in gardening and DIY. So people making use of their garden. We didn't see any significant changes in study or for unpaid housework, excluding sort of childcare and travel. But when we dig below the surface of that and we start to look at gender differentials, we do find actually that there was evidence that unpaid work was changing. So between the genders, there's been more convergence, which continues a longer term trend. Where men have engaged in more unpaid childcare and unpaid housework, and women have shed a little bit of that, and that's resulted in, once you combine that with the paid work changes, we've seen that there is a more balanced leisure time between men and women. So once we consider the results by income differentials, we can see actually that the increases in leisure time that we were seeing in the first chart are particularly prevalent for those of higher income households and middle income households, and perhaps that's not a surprise because those from lower income households would perhaps wouldn't necessarily be in work. And so when we consider the impact of the lockdown, when we consider increased leisure time, it's really that's the experience of those from the higher and mid-income households. The difference within the leisure time seems to be driven by consumption of mass media, but also once you look at the higher income brackets, you can see quite a big increase in playing games. So the second release we put out after sort of starting preparations for the Wave 2 collection was specifically about parenting. So we focused in specifically on parents. And when we did that and started to analyse childcare, we can see that women, once you factor in the time which women said they were supervising children for, really were more responsible for the supervision of children. Once you look at the non-developmental childcare, that's mainly the washing, feeding, dressing of children, there is also a really big difference in that area. Where we find things are more equal is with helping with homework and sort of the homeschooling area. So men and women have been quite balanced in that area with no significant difference there. We analysed the data looking at working patterns, and so we started to split the groups looking at diaries where there's people, a percentage of those working from home. We looked at sort of their work hours during the day, and then we looked at those days where people were working away from the home, and these sorts of tempograms plot the percentage of the group engaged in the work on the left at different times of day. And so we can see that those working from home tended to do so in the morning hours, whereas those working away from the home tended to do so more frequently in the afternoon or more consistently through the whole day. And then when we turn to the chart on the right, we look at those who on days, sort of parents who have been working from home versus those who have been working away from the home. And we can see on those days, we see more developmental childcare from those working from home in the afternoon hours, which possibly suggests that they're working more intensively in the morning, or more of them are working in the morning, and then choosing to do the homeschooling in the afternoon. And so when we started to unpick some of the experience, so looking at the enjoyment data, and we've got a log coefficient on the scale at the bottom, what we've done is we've looked at the amount of time in different types of activity and then we've applied a log transformation to it, because when you look at the increases of time, the sort of if you increase your time in an activity, it doesn't necessarily continue to build your enjoyment of it in a straight line. You tend to sort of that enjoyment, it sort of tails off, and the metric is a 1 to 7 enjoyment scale, which is bounded as well. So, but when we do that, we have an insight into how enjoyable different types of childcare are. And so the more equally shared sort of developmental childcare, certainly in the first few weeks of the lockdown, seemed to be quite enjoyable. So you look sort of about the equivalent of watching TV or streaming media and only falling behind some of the exercise. The non-developmental childcare, the washing, feeding and dressing is less enjoyable, but still more enjoyable than the average. Whereas other types of unpaid work were definitely, like cleaning and vacuuming, and even paid work were less enjoyable. So to summarize those results, we've seen large downward trend in travel time. We've seen an upward increase in leisure time, and that's been driven by those from mid and high income households. We've also had insight into their time, or their increase in leisure time, which has been driven sort of by mass media and games. And then we found that the parents working from home tended to homeschool in the afternoons, and women took the brunt of the developmental childcare, non-developmental childcare, while the developmental childcare was certainly enjoyable in the early lockdown. So the next steps of our study are to finish the Wave 2 collection, which is currently ongoing. We're testing a £20 incentive. We've improved some of the materials and the diary, so we're sort of still building this project as we test it. And we have adapted our communications to be coronavirus specific, which was something we didn't have in the first wave. When we get that data back in, we're going to start to analyse more with the larger data that enables us to have sort of transforming from around 2,000 diary days to about 4,000 diary days. That will allow insights into the impact of digital economy, more of the less frequent activities or the rare occurrence activities such as adult care. And the Scottish Government are building an equalities index, which should be published later in the year as well. We are interested in analysing the exercise patterns and how those have been changing through the pre and post coronavirus times. And certainly the commuting patterns and the return back to the office is something which we have earmarked for analysis. And we will be also uploading this data to the UK Data Archive for wider research purposes. And that's it from me. I'd like to just thank the team here. You see the names of from the Economic Wellbeing and Digital Transformation branch on their work. And also I should mention that the digital colleagues at ONS have been really helpful for producing some of the content which you see in the presentation today and the articles. Thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you very much, Chris. A really good presentation, I thought. So I'll encourage attendees to post any questions that they have in the Q&A box. We don't have any questions at the moment. One question I had, Chris, so you mentioned some really interesting next steps, but I was wondering if there were any plans to do any sort of special pieces. So for example, you talked about the piece that you did on parents specifically, whether there were any other subgroups of the population that you might have a look at in more detail, perhaps different age groups or any other demographics.
I think the subgroups, I think we in future we might like to do more on some of the minority groups. We are looking at how representative the sample is once we break it down to minority groups, but it is quite difficult. So if we can't achieve analysis of, say, the disabled group or with disabilities, then we would look to see how can we improve that in future samples. So again, it's sort of dependent on how successful the pilot is, but so far we've got quite a good range of responses across sort of ethnicities, religions, and so on. So it's starting to build, but we are monitoring it. So that's sort of a goal for us. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Chris. So I don't think there are any questions at the moment from anyone on the call, so I'll just give it a couple of minutes or so in case anyone would like to ask a question. So we do have a question from Jessica. So Jessica, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Okay. Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, so I'm Jessica from Niger. I just wanted to ask if you also had issues that somebody have about over-reporting or under-reporting, for example, that men tend to overstate how much unpaid work they do.
I think it comes back to sort of our reliance on the time diary data. So what we've seen is it is a sort of convergence of men and women, but in the same sort of trend as we saw comparing the 2014-15 survey with the 2000 survey. So I think that it's been fairly accurate. I think that the advantages of going back to the time diary is that allowing people to sort of to populate the diary. I mean, there's 73 activities within there, so I think that it's difficult for people to sort of start to input activities which they haven't actually done, because it sort of starts to affect the sort of the rest of their diary as they're sort of reflecting on what they've done during their day. So I think the sort of the design of the diary, where we're not specifically asking people how much unpaid work have you done. I mean, we haven't found that men have reported very large amounts of all different types of unpaid work. In fact, you know, when we drilled into the parenting and the childcare stuff, there was, you know, some there was significantly more done by women than men. So I think there will always be some kind of social desirability bias in data, but I'm quite confident that the diary data has limited that effect much more than perhaps a stylized questionnaire. If you just said, oh, how much unpaid work have you've done over the last week or so. We'd be looking at in future some sort of data science initiatives where we'll be trying to, I think we've already started to look at it, but things like Garmin data and using some of the geolocation stuff. So once we have some of that evidence, okay, it won't give us the full picture, but it might be a way to validate what's in the diary, to look for markers where we think people might have overestimated this or underestimated this within the diary. But so far, I haven't seen anything which I think is dubious from the results. And women, it's worth saying, still do the vast majority of the unpaid work, particularly when you look at the totality of it in the 2020 data as well.
Great, thanks, Chris. So we've also got a question from Alex, Romanko, and Kimberly. So Alex, if you'd like to ask your question first, and then I'll read out Kimberly's.
Thank you, Chris, for a wonderful presentation. My name is Alex. I'm from King's College London. So just a short question. Can you please elaborate a bit more how this work integrates into future plans of ONS and future agenda and action points of ONS?
I'm sorry, I couldn't really hear the question.
Yeah, so I'm asking how the wonderful work that you've done integrates into a broad scope of future plans of national statistics.
Yes, so coming back to some of the digital stuff and looking at some of the recommendations of the Bean Review, we really want to start to look at the extent of engagement within sharing economy activities. We want to sort of try to see how reliant people are becoming on digital services, so online banking, use of social media platforms, and try to compare online services and the quality of them to some extent against the physical alternatives. So I think one of the first places to do that would be looking at online shopping versus use of the high street and how that's changing. But certainly it's trying to feed into the beyond GDP agenda and trying to get more of the household focus, particularly in relation to the economic transformation program and the recommendations of the Bean Review, the recommendations of the Stiglitz report, but in a sort of COVID focus really now, because I think that will continue to drive the agenda for a while, just to look at it from that perspective as well.
Great, thanks Chris, and thank you Alex. So Kimberly's got a question and she's able to unmute. So Kimberly, would you like to ask your question?
Hi Chris.
Hi Kimberly.
My question relates to the paid time and the enjoyment of said work. So I know you don't links to whether people worked previously now or not, but I wonder if you've been able to compare the work from home time patterns and how that's changed in relation to enjoyment, and if you've made any kinds of comparisons between this paid work time and the labor market statistics on paid work time, if you can tell anything about how the enjoyment of the working at home during the pandemic experience, if that's changing over time. And are there any
question
going forward?
We haven't done the analysis yet to look at in that detail at the enjoyment levels, but we can do that. We can start to unpick the different types of working time, and I guess we could also factor in the enjoyment of commuting time as well. To if you're working at home, you're saving that time, but certainly the data lends itself to a more sort of comprehensive analysis of the enjoyment of work days in general. So we could do that, but we haven't got to the point yet where we've had the opportunity to do it within the branch. Just I think we're sort of being focused a bit on the development of the second wave and of collection, and we'll put that down in our lists of things we should look at going forward.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Kimberly. I don't think there are any further questions, so I'll just give it one more minute because we've still got a couple of minutes of time left in case anyone does have anything they'd like to ask. Okay, I think that seems to be everything. Thank you very much for the presentation, Chris. Very informative. So I'm now going to share my screen because I'm up next. I'll hand over to myself. Right, okay. So hi everyone, I won't introduce myself again, but today I'm going to be presenting on how we're making use of online vacancy data to inform on how COVID-19 is impacting on the wider labour market, and also talk about some exploratory work that we've been doing to look at using this data to inform on human capital. So this is a collaborative project. We've been working with Oleksii Romanko from King's College London, as well as with some other ONS colleagues, Gueorguie Vassilev, Ryan Schofield and Martin Wood. So during the presentation today, I'm going to provide a brief background into the work that we've been doing and explain why it's so important, and also talk a little bit about our current source of online vacancy data, which is Adzuna, and how that compares with alternative sources. I'll then share some of the latest results and time series from the data, which were published yesterday morning, before I talk a little bit more about the wider challenges that we faced in using this data, and also explain some of the methods that we've adopted to produce regional breakdowns, to deduplicate the data, and also to extract skills information. And finally, then I will close the presentation just by giving some insights into the future developments for this project. So first of all, I'll begin by providing some context on why online vacancy data is really useful. So if we first consider from a human capital perspective, ONS first outlined plans to use online vacancy data to derive an alternative measure of human capital back in 2018 as part of our forward work plan. So we plan to use the job adverts data to analyse the relationship between skills and earnings, and we plan to do that by extracting the skills that were being asked for in various jobs and linking them to the corresponding salaries that were being offered to those jobs. So that was the original scope of the project, and something that I'm going to talk about in more detail later on in the presentation. But following the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic back in March, we quickly realised that we could utilise this data to provide an early indicator of how the labour market is changing by using job adverts as a proxy for vacancies. So there's a lot of granularity in job adverts data, so we can produce detailed breakdowns such as by location and industry categories on a timely basis. And we also recognised that we could use some of the techniques that we'd already started considering to extract skills information, to extract other useful information from the job adverts. So for example, looking at things like whether the ways that we were working were changing. So if there were increased number of job adverts being offered as remote or working from home opportunities. So since we started producing these data on a weekly basis back in May, we've had a lot of positive feedback and engagement from stakeholders. So there's many different users of this data, other government departments, academics, also sort of research organisations. And one of the key requirements that came through for us were breakdowns by region and occupation. So at the moment, we've been able to publish NUTS level 1 regional breakdowns, but we also recognise that there is a big user need for lower level geographical information. So that's something that we're working on currently. And what's also been clear is as there are so many different organisations working in this space, it's been really useful for us to collaborate with other areas and get feedback on the various methodologies that we've been implementing. So things like deduplication methods. So one of the main aims of this presentation today is to get some additional feedback on what we've been doing. So if you do have any comments or questions, then please do get in touch with us. I've included some contact information on the last slide of the presentation. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about the source that we're using. So Adzuna is an online job platform who are currently working in partnership with ONS. And they've made data available to us that has been extracted from their online job search engine. So it's a very rich data set with information on the job description, the job title, the location, the category, which is an Adzuna provided variable, but it loosely aligns to standard industry classifications in some cases. And there's also some salary information included. So on this slide, I've relayed some of the strengths and limitations with the Adzuna data, but it's important to note that these actually apply to alternative sources of online vacancy data. So first, if we think about the strengths of the data, a key benefit of using this is the timeliness. So Adzuna provide real-time snapshots of data that are updated every few hours. So we currently take an extract of this data on a Friday, and we're able to publish that data as part of our faster indicators release the following Thursday. So we're currently operating on a 6-day time lag, which is obviously really timely as an indicator. Also, because we have access to these weekly extracts, we can analyze the week-on-week comparisons, which is really useful for us in terms of picking up early trends. Secondly, most adverts in the data are very detailed and they include a lot of information, which provides a lot of scope for analysis. So, for example, we're able to look at things like location, occupation, and salary, but also the skill requirements and the ways of working. And the final strength, Adzuna cover a multitude of sources, so from job boards to individual company websites, which means that they do have a high coverage, although it is important to remember that the source is limited to online vacancies only. So there will be some job adverts which aren't covered, so job adverts that might be advertised internally or by word of mouth. So now to consider some of the limitations. So it's really important to note that the number of job adverts is not a direct measure for labour demand. So it is a proxy measure, and there may be other changes like the activities of recruitment. So for example, changes of coverage can have an impact. There's also a potential time lag to consider. So for example, some recruitment agencies may not be as reactive in removing a job advert than others. So Adzuna do carry out cleaning, which means they remove any adverts which have not been live for 30 days. But as long as a job advert is live on at least one job platform, it will be included in the data. And finally, another limitation of the data is around duplication. And I'll talk about this in a bit more detail in a later slide. But what this relates to is when there are multiple job adverts for one post. And we do know that there are cases, so points in time where duplication is a great risk, and that could lead to the inflation of the number of job adverts. So we did undertake some quality assurance of the Adzuna data by comparing with other sources. So for example, the ONS vacancy survey. So although the two sources cover different things, as job adverts do not directly relate to vacancies, a comparison between the two can still give an indication of the quality of the data. And as you can see from this chart, the trends that we see in Adzuna data are fairly comparable to the vacancy survey at a high level. We also see that there is comparability in some of the Adzuna categories, and this tends to be some of the categories that align more closely with standard industry classifications, so things like retail, catering and hospitality, and education. So I'm now going to show some of the latest results from the data. So these will cover the period up until the 11th of September, and they're using the data that was published on our website yesterday. So we present the data as an index series, indexed to the 2019 average number of job adverts. And the reason we chose to display the data in this way is because we know that there are levels of duplication in the data, which means that the levels aren't as accurate as other sources. So by producing an indexed series, then we can instead focus on the change in trends over time. So you'll see that the figure on the left-hand side of this slide shows the total job advert series, as well as some category breakdowns, which our users find most interesting. So it's clear from the chart the initial impact of COVID-19, which resulted in total job adverts falling by almost 50% from the start of March to the start of May. So this was seen across most categories, although understandably the health and social care category remained stable, and also the education category wasn't affected quite as badly as some others. And you can also see that we have started to see some recovery in job adverts in recent weeks. So as well as producing the online job adverts at a total level and category breakdowns, we're also able to produce NUTS level 1 regional breakdowns of the data. So in this chart shown here, the red bars are representing the drop in job adverts compared to the 6th of March. So that would be a pre-pandemic period. And it's compared to the lowest point reached during the pandemic. So the lowest point may have been at different weeks for different regions. But from the data, we can see that all regions saw a drop of at least 60%, with Yorkshire and the Humber being the worst affected, with a drop of 70%. The green bars then show the recovery in job adverts from the lowest point reached during the pandemic compared to the latest week of data. So we do need to be very careful when interpreting this chart. So as you can see, Northern Ireland appears to have had the strongest recovery, but Northern Ireland has been subject to some coverage changes over this time period. So if you look at the indices that we publish on our website, you will see that there is a level shift in the Northern Ireland data in August 2020, and that's due to a new source being included in the data, which is impacting the results. So aside from Northern Ireland, we can also see that East Midlands has then had the strongest recovery. And finally on the chart, we have the white dots, which hopefully you can see on the red bars. And these represent the overall change from the 6th of March to the latest week. And then there is a bar that is slightly darker near the middle of the chart, and that represents the overall UK value, which is currently, I think, around 45% lower than at the 6th of March. And we can use that as a benchmark to see which regions have fared slightly better and which have fared slightly worse. So in the coming weeks, we're hoping to publish regional breakdowns split by category, so to introduce some extra granularity for users. And we're also hoping to produce breakdowns at a lower geographical level. So we've had some user requests for data available at local authority level, and also local enterprise partnerships. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about some of the methodology we've used when working with the Adzuna data. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is that it's really important to note that there is a lot of pre-processing when working with online vacancy data to address some of the challenges that we have. So for example, on this slide I've included some examples. So many of the variables in the data are unstandardized. So for example, salary information. So the format of salary offered for a job can vary broadly across different job adverts. So some may include special currency symbols and some might not. Some may provide a number, but some also may provide a salary range. And we also have the issue of some non-salary related phrases, so things like bonuses being offered. So in order to process the salary information, we've used regular expressions to extract the salary and also try and identify the rate at which it's being offered. So it can differ between hourly, daily, weekly or yearly rates. So we've tried to extract that information to produce one standardized variable, which is in the annual form. One limitation of our current method is that we're not taking account of any bonuses that are being offered for jobs. So that's a potential future development. We've also applied some other data cleaning methods, such as removing white space and special characters from some of the variable fields. And we've also tried to standardize job titles so as to make it easier to match them across two standard occupational classifications. So to do that, we've used a Python package, which is called Find Job Titles. And within that package, they have over 77,000 clean job titles, which can be extracted from data. So we use that in conjunction with some manual cleaning techniques. So next, I'm just going to briefly talk about the method we're using for assigning job adverts to the NUTS Level 1 region. So we're using the raw location variable that is provided by the creator of the job advert. So there are some challenges with this variable, the main one being that it is a free text field. So there's no standardization in terms of what people can include. So that means that some job adverts may have a really detailed location with streets and postcodes, but others may be advertised at a very high level. So for example, London or even England or the UK. So we've taken a three-stage approach to assigning regional NUTS Level 1 regions to the job adverts. So first of all, we use regular expressions to identify and extract postcodes, and we link those to a lookup file to extract the corresponding region. So we've taken this to be the most accurate information, and so that's why it's the first sort of level of this hierarchical approach. Then for all job adverts which don't have a postcode, we perform text matching. So we have a lookup file that consists of multiple different geography levels, so things like wards, local authorities and counties. And we do some text matching on the raw location to find the corresponding region for that location. And finally, we then apply some manual corrections to the data. So when using this approach, we encountered some issues with common place names across the UK. So for example, there are multiple different Newcastles in the UK and they're spread across different regions. So we've implemented some manual checks and processes to correct for these. So next I will talk about duplication, which I've been alluding to throughout the presentation. So duplication is an issue in the Azuna data and other online vacancy data, whereby there are adverts for the same post that are being included in the data more than once. And the aim of our deduplication work is to get to a point where we only have one advert for each post, which would then give us an improved measure of labour demand. So in terms of the causes for this, it primarily occurs due to location spamming. So the primary goal of job platforms is to find applicants. So when a post is advertised at a high level, so for example, London, they may then duplicate that advert across all different wards in London so as to increase the pickup by potential applicants. Another cause of duplication is where a job might be advertised across a different platform and each platform may have use a different job description. So they may alter the job advert slightly to make it more unique and this makes it really difficult to identify those kinds of duplicates in the data. And then the last point to note on duplication is that it's also true that job adverts can be underrepresented the true number of vacancies. So for example, some companies may use only one advert when in reality they're looking for multiple posts to be filled. So if we consider, for example, a supermarket who may be looking to recruit a number of cashiers, they may use one singular job advert that actually corresponds to multiple posts. But at the moment, we'd only be including this as one. So in considering potential methods to address these issues, we carried out a lot of work looking at different things like cosine distancing measures, where we transformed the text of an advert into vectors and then calculated the cosine similarity of the vectors to determine how similar those two pieces of text were. And we then applied a threshold to the comparisons to determine which adverts were in fact duplicates. We also considered using SIMHASH and MINHASH algorithms, which use similar methods to compare text. But what we found were these complex methods were very resource intensive, and for the volume of data that we were trying to deduplicate, it became really difficult to run essentially. So after a lot of work in this area, we concluded that many of the duplicates in the data could be identified by implementing some simpler data cleaning methods. So for example, we found that many adverts just had some extra white space or some extra special characters, but were otherwise identical. And we also found that the only distinguishable factor between some adverts was either the first or last sentence of the advert. So by removing these, we were able to then improve the data set. So we do still have some work to do in this area before we can get to the stage of publishing a deduplicated time series. So we welcome feedback from any attendees who may have comments on how we could consider that. So the final part of methodology I'm going to discuss today is around skills extraction. So we're still in the early stages of this work, but we've developed an initial algorithm which we're using to extract skills. The approach that we've taken is to use a word-to-vec model, which is a natural language processing technique that uses a neural network model to learn word associations from text extracts. So the model is using a skills non-commensure that we've extracted from a website called dice.com. And within that, there is over 11,000 unique skills. And then for each of these skills, we took descriptions from Wikipedia to provide some more context around the skill. So to provide an example of how the algorithm works, included on this slide is an example extract of a job advert included in the Adzuna data. So we've removed the company name for disclosure purposes, of course, but you can see that Company X is an online tutoring platform that's looking to recruit new tutors. So within the advert, we can see on this slide that there are some skill requirements, such as knowledge of specific programs and techniques, as well as some prerequisites of what an applicant would need to start in the post. So given this example, this slide shows how the algorithm would work. So the text highlighted in yellow is what's included in the original advert, and the text highlighted in green is what the algorithm would extract. So we can see, first of all, the algorithm would pick up that the advert is looking for a tutor, and so they will require skills in tutoring. Next, the algorithm will also highlight the specific technologies that are required for the job. So for example, we can see that Microsoft Link is mentioned, Skype for Business is mentioned, Windows PowerShell. And then finally, the algorithm also highlights some of the prerequisites. So in this case, the applicant would require a smartphone for the job. That's obviously not something that we would classify as a skill, but it still could provide some useful information. So it's an interesting part of the algorithm to look into further. I should note that at this point in time, the algorithm doesn't produce these three breakdowns separately. So for example, it wouldn't tell you which part of the advert is relating to skills and which is relating to prerequisites. It'll just extract all of this information and return that as the results. So apologies, I think this slide might be a little bit hard to see. So you don't need to see the text, but I just wanted to include this diagram, which basically highlights how the algorithm learns which type of skills are similar. So in this picture, all of those skills that are in the sort of yellow color, they're technical skills that sort of relate to different programming tools. So we haven't explored this in too much detail at the moment, but it illustrates some of the capabilities of the algorithm. And then finally on skills extraction, I just wanted to highlight some initial summary statistics that we've produced. So these results are based on extracts of Adzuna taken in May and then again in September. So we've been able to capture some changes over time. So the chart on the left shows the average number of skills per advert, which we can see is very low in most cases. So around 4 skills per advert. And then also we can see that there are some outliers in the data. So at the other end, we see some adverts which asking for almost 40 skills. So when we looked into some of these use cases, they related to jobs in the IT sector. So roles such as software developers, which required the knowledge of many different programming languages. And then on the right, we can see the most popular skills that are asked for in the education sector particularly. So we can see that tutoring has become more popular since May, whereas most other subject-specific skills have remained fairly constant. So again, all of these results are very early and we're still refining the algorithm, but we just wanted to share them with attendees to get some feedback on our approaches. So looking to the future, Just to close the presentation, I want to talk about some of the future developments that we have planned. I've already mentioned one key user request is for more granular geography breakdowns. We're hoping to be able to implement this in our weekly publications in the next few weeks. We're also going to be applying deduplication methods with the end goal to be able to publish a deduplicated series or even a number of series. And we'll also be looking to allocate job adverts to standard occupation codes. We'll also be developing our algorithm to improve our skill demand measure. Some of the specific things that we want to look at are developing a market price of skills and also looking at specific skills. So whether there are new skills that are being offered, asked for as a result of COVID. And we'll also be looking at whether there are changes in the way of working. So whether adverts are asking for different, maybe remote or working from home opportunities. So I'm happy to take any questions now. Thank you very much. If you do have feedback, please contact us at economicwellbeing@ons.gov.uk.
Thanks, Chloe. Really, really interesting presentation. Once again, there's no questions in the question box at the moment, but while people have a chance to write one, I add a question for you. You mentioned that there is further work to be done. Is be included in the weekly Faster Indicators publication, or are there plans to publish standalone articles which go into further analysis?
Thank you, that's a great question. So some of the things we would look to implement in the weekly series, but some of the breakdowns that we mentioned, so for example, publishing regional breakdowns by category would be quite resource intensive to turn around within 1 week, because obviously the more granular the data is, the more quality assurance and disclosure control checking we need to carry out. So we've talked about possibilities of publishing every 2 weeks. And yes, we've also talked about potential one-off articles where we could delve into the data a lot more detail than's allowed in the Faster Indicators release. So it's definitely something we're exploring, and obviously we're very much driven by user requests. So we'd encourage anyone who would like to see further breakdowns of the data to get in touch with us.
Brilliant, thank you. We just had a question from Alex, so I'll just ask him to be unmuted and then he can ask his question. Not too sure whether his microphone will be able to mute.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you for unmuting me. Thank you, Khloe, for presentation. This was really great. So a short question is whether there are any plans to go towards skills supply as well.
Yeah, so I think longer term is definitely user interest in looking at the skill supply side of things, and it's definitely something that we'd be interested in doing. I think the key challenges is finding data sources for skill supply. So I'm aware of some other organisations who are trying to work with CV information to try and extract skills, the different skills that the population has. And it's definitely something that, yeah, we'd like to consider in the future. And obviously much more related to the human capital angle as well.
Brilliant, thank you. There's another question here from Kanya. She can't use her microphone, so I'll just read her question out. If there are local types of employment which maybe opt for more traditional forms of vacancy advertisements, would this be missed by the data set? Or do you have an idea of how big or small a problem this might be?
Yeah, so that is a very good question. Thank you, Kanya. So we are aware that the coverage of Azuna and all online vacancy data is obviously limited to online vacancies. You're right, there may be some particular locations or even some industries that are more likely to advertise in a more traditional way. So for example, by word of mouth, or maybe advertising in the shop window, those kind of avenues. So it's something that we're aware of. We don't have an idea of how big or small that problem may be. In terms of an industry level, we can obviously refer to the ONS monthly vacancy survey, which covers all types of companies, but they don't provide data at the moment on the regional basis. So we don't really have a comparison point for that information, but it's definitely an important point and something that we are looking into, yes.
Okay, thank you. There's no further questions at the moment, but I'll just give it another minute or so in case anyone else thinks of one.
Great.
I think that's all the questions.
Fab. Okay, well, thank you everyone for listening and attending these talks. If you do have any other further questions, then feel free to contact any of the presenters today. We'll be helpful to take this discussion offline. And yeah, thank you very much for attending. I think we'll close it there.